victims had been found, gagged, strangled with a cord, and hanging from a pipe in the basement.
The body was discovered here at 53rd Street North.
You're dealing with a person who is perverted, a person that is sick. That person is going to kill again.
By the time police got to Vicki Wegerle's house on West 13th, her heart had already stopped beating.
Killed 7 people, Chief. What kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all, and nothing that will point us to any one particular individual.
More of a good father, husband, raised my kids, did a lot of things for them, did a lot of things for the community. I started on the dark side a long time before that, and the volcano was finally starting to erupt. People call me a monster. I guess I am sort of a monster.
How does Dennis Rader, a man who's a leader in his church, a family man, has a good job, active in his community, and worked with the Boy Scouts, how does this man end up killing 10 innocent people in the area of Wichita and terrorizing the community for nearly 30 years? He does it very carefully and very quietly, and these aren't traits you pick up overnight. They're things you learn after a long life of introversion and quiet perversion. Many serial killers grow up in traumatic or difficult settings, which embeds and deep-seeds psychological issues. Dennis Rader, well, he just doesn't have this excuse. His childhood was pretty run-of-the-mill, even healthy by some standards. Dennis Rader was born March 9, 1945 to William and Dorothy Rader in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He would be the first of 4 boys that William and Dorothy would have. William was in the Marine Corps in World War II and worked for Kansas Electrical Utility after the war. Dorothy worked as a bookkeeper and kept the family home. Young Dennis Rader grew up playing on his family's land with his brothers. He was a part of the Boy Scouts and participated regularly in events at the Lutheran Church. Dennis was close to his parents, who were both healthy influences. He was closer to his father, who spent a lot of time with them doing things for Boy Scouts, fishing, and going to church. As a boy, he had a need for attention that he never quite grew out of. Dennis went to Riverview Elementary School, where his withdrawn personality and average performance made him about as special as canned corn. And contrary to popular belief at the time, he was actually a very interesting corn can, mutating and molding something putrid within. Because it was while in grade school that Dennis started noticing that certain situations excited him in ways that he couldn't get enough of. He found that while playing cowboys and Indians, tying up captives gave him a rush, almost as big as the rush that he got when he was bound up as a bounty himself. That strange feeling struck once again, one afternoon while Dennis's mother was cleaning the house. As she went to vacuum under the couch, her ring got caught on a loose spring from underneath the couch. She was stuck in a painful position and couldn't get free. She asked Dennis to go get help. Seeing his mother in pain and unable to move helped to awaken something within him. It was a moment that he would never forget. He started to realize that it was the helplessness that he enjoyed seeing, the fear. He liked imagining what he could do to somebody while they were tied up. As Dennis grew into puberty, his curiosity would turn into perverse acts of violence against animals that were there on the farm. Stray cats and dogs would be his target. Once he caught them, he would trap them in a box and cut out a hole just large enough for its head. When its head popped out, he would throw a noose around it and pull. His sexual taste for bondage and sadistic torture would not stop with animals. Those were just the tests. And in his mind, he was already fantasizing about binding and raping girls in a very controlled and almost produced and directed way. While still in grade school, he already had the perfect victim in mind.
Who's the little lady who's as dainty as a dream? Who's the one you can't forget? I'll give you just 3 guesses. Annette.
Actress Annette Funicello, a Mouseketeer on the original Mickey Mouse Club TV show in the 1950s, was one of his favorite imaginary victims. As his fantasies matured, he focused on a more attainable target. Dennis's 5th grade teacher was a dominant presence in the classroom and would often pick on the weaker boys in class, boys like Dennis. He began daydreaming about hurting her, which would develop into him following her home and spying on her there. He couldn't bring himself to harm the woman, but he did tie himself to a fence outside while he watched her in her house. This was enough for him to get off before he scampered home. Dennis also took an interest in murder at a young age. This kicked off when 14-year-old Dennis Rader overheard the other kids riding on the bus to school talking about the Clutter murders, a brutal quadruple homicide that occurred in Holcomb, Kansas, that was all over the news. In the early morning hours of November 15, 1959, 4 members of the Clutter family, Herb Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their teenage children Nancy and Kenyon had all been tied up and shot in the head with a shotgun in a robbery gone wrong. 2 men who had recently been released from prison, Perry Edward Smith and Richard Hickok, had been told that somewhere there on the family farm was a safe that was stuffed with cash. After breaking in and restraining the family, they would be greatly disappointed to find out their information was garbage. There was never a safe. In fact, there was not much of value there at all. They had come hoping to make it out clean with a nest egg to start their post-prison lives, but were now faced with the harsh reality. There were 4 witnesses to their crime, and they were not leaving empty-handed just to go back to the clink. One by one, they mercilessly killed the family before stealing a tiny bit of cash and a transistor radio. Both Smith and Hickok would be arrested in Las Vegas just 6 weeks later, and they would eventually be hanged at Kansas State Prison. Dennis Rader followed the story with great interest and admiration of the 2 shitbags that carried out the horrible crime. The part that really got Dennis's little pecker hard, though, was the fact that they had bound the Clutters before making head confetti of them. The Clutter murders would live in his head for the rest of his life and even inspire his own handiwork later on. Another monster Dennis took interest in was Harvey Glattman, a serial killer from the 1950s. Known as the Glamour Girl Slayer and the Lonely Heart Killer, he posed as a professional photographer and lured in naive young women. He would convince them to take risque photos for pulp magazines. With the promise of success and fame, Glattman would convince women to let him tie them up in compromising ways for the photos. But once he had them where he wanted them, he would flip the script. Pictures would be taken, but so would the women, any way that he wanted. And when Harvey Glattman was finished with them, he would strangle the lives from their bodies. Dennis admired the way that Harvey Glattman finished his victims off, as well as how he took pictures of them during the process, capturing the fear in their eyes, as they knew their lives would soon come to an end. Unknown to Dennis at the time, Harvey had also taken an interest in tying himself up from a very young age, even exploring the art of autoerotic asphyxiation. To the uninitiated, this is when you choke yourself and your chicken at the same time. Harvey Glattman would be arrested in 1958 after killing at least 3 women. He met his fate in the gas chamber of San Quentin Prison the following year. Dennis's admiration for killers who bound and asphyxiated their victims played a large part in where his life was going, but he did a phenomenal job of keeping his sadistic interests close to the chest. Despite his role models and odd personal pastimes, somehow Dennis made it all the way through high school without raising any major red flags. He would graduate from Wichita Heights High School in 1963 and pick up work at a local grocery store. In the summer of 1966, at 21 years old, Dennis decided to join the Air Force. It's speculated that maybe he did this to dodge the Army draft for the Vietnam War, but regardless, Rader served in the U.S. Air Force from 1966 to 1970. He was stationed in Turkey, Greece, Japan, and South Korea. During this time, he would ramp up his voyeurism, making it a regular habit to peek through window blinds to watch women undress. He would also escalate to breaking into homes and stealing undergarments. And he did it all without getting caught. So when 25-year-old Dennis Rader returned to his hometown of Wichita, he was warmly welcomed back by his family and friends. The community was a tight-knit one, a crime-free area where agriculture and aviation were the main industries. Dennis fell right back into the community he'd remembered, playing basketball with his brothers and attending church with his family. In 1971, Dennis got a job in the meat department at Leaker's IGA. This was the same place that his mother had been bookkeeping for years, and I'm sure she was happy to put in a good word for her son. After all, what mattered in this community was family values, having a good job, going to church, and raising a family. And Mom wasn't done setting Dennis up for success just yet. Not long after coming home, Dennis's parents were already trying to set him up with a nice woman from church. And Mama was steering him straight because not long after meeting Paula Dietz, a graduate of Dennis's same high school just 3 years after him and a secretary at the VA hospital, that the two fell madly in love and settled down together. On May 22nd, 1971, Dennis and Paula would be wed and start to plan a family. The newlyweds would make the move to the suburb Park City after getting married at 6220 Independence, where they would grow their family for decades to come. Knowing he wanted to be set up financially to be a good father, Dennis scrambled in the following years to get more education and set himself up for success. That same year, he began taking classes at Butler Community College in El Dorado.
Ew, it's El Dorado.
In 1972, Dennis got a factory job for Coleman Co., the famous camping company, where he would work until 1973 when he was offered a dream job working for Cessna. In 1973, Dennis transferred back to Wichita State University, where he had briefly tried a bit of college before enlisting in the Air Force. He would study criminal justice with the ultimate goal of becoming a police officer. And this was a busy time for Dennis. With the stress of a new wife, college courses, and trying to impress at his dream job bearing down on him, he needed to unwind like any of us would. But instead of cracking a beer or going on a hike, Dennis would unwind by trolling. This is what he would call driving or walking around neighborhoods or campuses with women that he could fantasize about. He made the habit of creating fictional targets in his head, stalking them for days and fantasizing about hiding in their cars and taking them at gunpoint so he could torture and kill them. But somehow Dennis was able to weave these aspects of his life so seamlessly into the movements of an average NPC. Nobody would suspect Dennis, the church-going community man, working and going to school. The character that Dennis Rader played every day was perfectly masking him as he moved around the city. And all of these fantasies that he was letting take over his thoughts while he was trolling around his work or school spaces were on the verge of slipping into the ether and becoming a real-life monster. All he needed was a push. And as fate would have it, in late 1973, Dennis would suddenly lose his dream job at Cessna. The amount of free time that he now had on his hands allowed him to slip deeper into his sadistic fantasies. Now unemployed and coming unhinged, Dennis would find himself daydreaming about tying up and murdering women so often that it was becoming an obsession. The monster inside him was now fully awake and clawing to be free. Just a few months later, while driving home from dropping his wife off at work, Dennis would spot 33-year-old Julia Otero walking her kids to school one day. He had actually recognized the mother of 5 from working at Coleman, where she had been one of his fantasy victims, but she was the first one that he would make real.
Basically, I just focused on that all the time. I was up to the neighborhood. I'd check on that house, one thing after another.
He knew exactly when to strike, when Julia would be the most vulnerable. By trolling around her house, Dennis noticed that she was alone with the 2 youngest children during the week once her husband was off to work. That's when he would cut the phone line and break in.
I had a barn that sticked out northwest of Wichita that I was going to take her and kidnap her. Probably hang her.
Here he could take his time, he could take pictures, and eventually he could hang her without worrying about any pesky witnesses. His plan, he thought, was bulletproof, and on January 15, 1974, Dennis Rader would begin his path into infamy. He drove and parked in the Otero's neighborhood before approaching 803 North Edgemore. Unfortunately for Dennis, this morning was a little different for the Oteros. Joseph Otero Sr., the father, had taken his 3 oldest kids to school early that morning to prepare for testing that they had that day. And for whatever reason, Joseph Sr. decided to come back home that day before going to work, just moments before Dennis Rader began creeping up. He approached the back fence and looked over, where he saw dog prints. He had never seen or heard a dog while out trolling, so he hadn't anticipated dealing with a family dog. But he was already here and it was go time, so Dennis took the chance and jumped the fence. The dog turned out not to be a threat, so Dennis used the wire cutters he'd brought to snip the phone line. Still unaware that Joseph Sr. was home, he creeped up to the back door. As he was building the nerve and waiting on the moment to break in, one of the young children, still home, opened the back door to let the dog in. Dennis used the opportunity to barge in and pull his pistol out, but he was completely caught off guard by the man at the end of his weapon. Now looking down a situation that he had not prepared for, Dennis Rader had to go into improv mode. While waving his pistol around at the Oteros, he explained that he was a wanted and hungry man. He was on the run, and he somehow convinced them that he was only there to steal a bite to eat in the family car. Lucky, the family dog, who had not done his job all night, began to bark, and Dennis promptly had one of the young kids take him outside. Then he took the 4 members of the Otero family there at the house. 38-year-old Joseph Sr., 33-year-old Julia, 11-year-old Josephine, and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. back into a bedroom where he tied them all up. After having the hands and feet of Joseph Sr. and Julia Otero bound, he quickly decided that the family would have to die or else he would be ID'd. Mirroring the clutter murders that Dennis grew up admiring, he was determined to turn a botched break-in into a quadruple homicide. But Dennis hadn't come with a shotgun, and even if he had, he didn't want to shoot people. He got off on choking the life out of them. But this is a much slower, more personal, nuanced approach that usually took time getting used to, and this being his first kill, it showed. He attempted to suffocate Joseph Sr. by putting a bag over his head and using a cord to tighten it around his neck. Thinking that Joseph was good as dead, he moved on to Julia. Dennis chose to strangle her with his hands, something he had no experience in outside of cats. He squeezed her neck as hard as he could, fighting to hold her down as she struggled, until her body finally stopped moving. But just then he noticed Joseph Sr. gasping for air through a hole that he'd bitten through his bag. Thinking quickly, he replaced the bag around Joseph Sr.'s neck, this time lining it with cloth, preventing him from biting through. And as he finished that, Mrs. Otero began to wake up from her slumber. She wasn't dead after all. And back and forth he went, Dennis Rader, like a fumbling Mr. Bean, trying to clear out the Oteros there in that room.
At that time, the whole family just went, they went panicked on me, so I worked pretty quick. I got
What
Mrs.
did you, you worked pretty quick.
Well,
What
I mean,
did you do?
I strangled Mrs. Otero, and she went out, or passed out. I thought she was dead. She passed out. Then I strangled Josephine. She passed out, or I thought she was dead. And then I went over and put a bag on Junior's head, and then if I remember right, Mrs. Otero came back. She came back.
Did you strangle Mrs. Otero then,
Okay.
or did you go
First
back?
of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, or a bag put over his head and strangled. Then I thought he was going down, and I went over and strangled Mrs. Otero, and I thought she was down. Then I strangled Josephine, thought she was down, and then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head. After that, Mrs. Otero woke back up, and she was pretty upset what's going on. So I came back, and at that point in time, strangled her for the death strangle at that time.
With your hands or what?
No, with a cord, with a rope. And then I think at that point in time, I redid Mr. Otero, put the bag over his head, went over and then took Junior. Before that, she asked me to save her son, so I actually had taken the bag off, and then I was really upset at that point in time. So basically, when Mr. Otero was down, Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior. I put another bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time.
What did you do then?
Put a bag over his head. I put a cloth over his head, a T-shirt, and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he subsequently died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
All right, did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies. But that was after she was hung.
All right. What did you do then?
Went through the house, kind of cleaned it up. It's called the right-hand rule. You go from room to room. Picked everything up. I think I took Mr. Otero's watch. I guess I took a radio. I forgot about that, but apparently I took a radio.
Why did you take these things?
I don't know. I have no idea. Just.
With similarities bearing out between the Otero murders and the Clutter family murders, I think this radio was taken to pay homage to some of the men that made him who he was today. Because remember, way back during the Clutter family murders, Smith and Hickok had taken a radio as well after murdering a family.
What happened then?
I got the keys to the car. In fact, I had the keys, I think, earlier before that because I wanted to make sure I had a way of getting out of the house. And clean the house up a little bit, make sure everything's packed up, and left through the front door. And and went over to their car, and then drove over to Dylan's and left the car there. Then eventually walked back to my car.
After picking up his car, Dennis Rader went home and pretended like nothing had happened. He slipped right back into the other half of his personality, the Ned Flanders-shaped skin suit that he walked around in pretending to be human. After school let out that afternoon, the oldest 3 Otero kids arrived at home. They walked in through the backyard like they normally did, but the first thing that they noticed was that Lucky, their family dog, had been left outside. This was unusual. The oldest of the 3, 15-year-old Charlie, led Danny and Carmine cautiously into the house. Charlie went into the kitchen while the other 2 went down the hall. He noticed that his mother's purse was overturned on the stove, so he called out to her. Nothing. And that's when he heard Danny and Carmine frantically calling from down the hall for Charlie to come, because, as they put it, Mom and Dad were playing a bad joke. Death could be smelled in the air as Charlie entered the room and saw just what they were talking about. Their mother was visibly beaten up and lay motionless across the bed. Their dad was laying on the bedroom floor. He too was motionless, blood dried around his nose, with a belt still firmly around his neck. The Otero kids immediately tried to call the cops, but the phone line was dead. Thinking quickly, they ran next door and waited until police would arrive. And it wasn't until the search of the property began that the full horrors of the Otero house would start to come to light. 9-year-old Joseph Jr. was found dead in his bedroom next to his bed. His arms and legs were still bound, and a hood and bag were still tied tightly by a cord around his neck. The most shocking find, though, was 11-year-old Josephine Otero. She was found with her pants removed in the basement, bound and hanging from a pipe. And although there was semen visible there at the crime scene, Josephine had not been raped. Even though DNA profiling had not come around yet, the investigators collected the semen that they could find, hoping that future science might be able to bring this monster down.
The bodies of Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, their daughter Josephine, and their son Joseph II were discovered in their East Wichita home. The victims had been bound, gagged, and strangled with a cord.
It was an awful, truly devastating crime scene for anybody that worked it. In such a low crime community, the cops and public alike prayed that it was just a one-off crime. After all, the concept of a serial killer was not even a thing yet, especially not in Wichita, where nobody felt the need to lock their doors. At least they didn't, until the gruesome quadruple murder there on Edgemore Street made the community a little jumpy.
Bag over her head and a cord looped around her neck.
There was a paranoid feeling in the air.
And hanging from a pipe in the basement.
Everyone could feel it, because the Otero murders were a thing of nightmares, something nobody thought could really ever happen. But that's just because nobody understood the storm that was truly coming. Dennis Rader had now tasted something that quenched a thirst that he never knew he had. After that, stalking women or flipping through his dirty magazines could never give him the same feeling. And like a junkie who just discovered their vice, there was no keeping him away. And just a month or 2 after the Otero murders, Dennis Rader had already selected his next project. While on his way home from work one day, he recognized a woman that he used to work with at the Coleman plant. A pretty young 21-year-old woman named Catherine Bright. When he spotted Catherine, she just so happened to be walking up to her home one day, and it clicked. She would be his next victim. Now knowing where she lived, he would use any extra time between work or class to swing by and observe her patterns, and he would do it for about a month. He quickly determined that she lived alone, which was good. The plans he'd made for the Otero residence didn't exactly go to plan, and he was hoping for a smoother execution this time around. He logged her patterns meticulously to avoid any hiccups, and after nailing down her schedule, he knew exactly when she would be gone during the day. He planned to break into her house while she was out, and simply be waiting on her when she got home that afternoon. Easy peasy. But luck again would not be on his side, because the night before his plans were to unfold, an unpredictable element would be thrown into Dennis Rader's plan. Catherine Bright's 19-year-old brother, Kevin, had come to town from Valley Center to spend the evening with his sister and go shopping with her in the morning. Obviously, Dennis had not anticipated this. So when Dennis arrived at 3217 East 13th Street on April 4th, 1974, the house was empty, like he'd imagined. But when Kevin Bright walked into the house with his sister later that afternoon, Dennis had to improvise once again. With gun in hand, he had Kevin tie his sister up, and then Dennis tied Kevin up. He placed them in separate bedrooms and unplugged the telephone line from the wall. After spending some time terrorizing and torturing Catherine, He went into Kevin's room to attempt to strangle him, but Kevin fought back, breaking loose from his bonds. This led to the two fighting frantically, wrestling over the gun until Dennis managed to pull it away and shoot Kevin one time in the head. Kevin's body slumped to the floor, apparently dead, before Dennis made his way back to Catherine's bedroom to get back to what he came for. And it was while he was strangling Catherine that he heard Kevin, who was very much still alive, get up and escape out the front door.
He ran out of the place. The door was wide open. So I saw him running down the porch and heading out into the road. So it was just a total mess.
Dennis was planning to take his time with her. He wanted to enjoy those precious moments of helplessness. But with his plan now completely cooked, he knew he had to get the fuck out of there. He quickly stabbed Catherine to death with a knife and ran to the front door to see Kevin sprinting down the street. He was disappointed, not just because he was rushed, but because he had to stab Catherine. And like a lesbian punishing her partner's pussy with the strap on, he knew he had done the thing, but it just didn't give him the feeling that he wanted. He truly got off on strangling a bound and helpless victim, so stabbing Catherine gave him no satisfaction at all. In fact, he was left with an acute sense of disappointment. Kevin Bright directed the police to the crime scene as soon as he could. There, Catherine would be found, dead of multiple stab wounds. Working with police, he was also able to give a description that would result in a police sketch of the suspect. And I don't know if Kevin's description was off or if the police sketch artist was just half a handle of wild turkey in, but the people of Wichita were now on alert for somebody who looked like Bobby Lee.
And I truly don't remember, and it is on brand, but I don't remember ever trying to touch you. But if I did that, I literally don't remember, but if I did that, I'm sorry.
The police also failed to link Catherine Bright's murder with the Otero murders, seeing as how there were several differences in the crime scenes. But this wouldn't sit well with Dennis Rader. He wanted the attention, he wanted the credit for his work. So when a young man went to the police to confess to killing the Oteros with a couple of his friends, Dennis couldn't sit idly by. In October of 1974, Dennis, in a very cocky play, planted a letter in a particular mechanical engineering book at his local library. Then he called the Wichita Eagle-Beacon, telling them where they could find a juicy lead. And when the letter was discovered, it became obvious that the killer of the Otero family was not the attention whore that had confessed, but a different attention whore altogether. The letter had a unique writing style chock full of misspellings and grammatical errors, along with a strongly sexual tone. And this was something Dennis did intentionally to send police on a goose chase for a moron. The letter also went into detail about the Otero victims, their body positions, methods of murder, binding, knots, basically anything that the killer alone would know. It also stated plainly that the police were on the wrong track, and they would know when the murderer struck again.
Those three dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. Me? He. Okay. You see, he had it again. They will be on the next victim.
The police convinced the Eagle to not release the letter as to not scare the public, and things quieted back down. Residents of Wichita remained none the wiser that there was an active serial killer prowling their streets. Months passed without incident, which turned to years. A new police chief would take over the Wichita area in 1976. At this point, BTK wasn't on anybody's radar. Sure, there'd been a few brutal incidents in 1974, but nothing until now. Most people suspected the culprit to be in prison or dead, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Dennis Rader was merely on a break. Dennis Rader and his wife had had a son in 1975, and he was now helping to raise a family in a Park City suburb, controlling his urges the best he could. And he'd gotten a job with ADT, the home security company, in which he would go supervise installations of equipment. He wasn't done killing, not by a long shot. He was just learning new methods for not getting caught, acquiring the knowledge of how to bypass a security system, keeping a close eye for new potential victims, and tracking their routines. To get his kicks in the meantime, he would sneak into bedrooms of customers that he was servicing and find nice socks or panties to steal, which sustained his deviant drive for the moment. But he knew it wouldn't last, and he was taking note of several potential new projects for the upcoming years.
I could always fantasize or look for more victims. That was part of the excitement, is being able to do the hunts. If I wasn't real busy, then I would go out on my prowling and look for my next victim. They were basically projects.
Now you call these projects, were these sexual fantasies also?
Potential hits. Yeah, in my world, that's what I call them.
So
They're
you
called
went,
projects, hits.
all right, and why did you have these potential hits? Was this to gratify some sexual interest? Or?
Yes, sir. I had a lot of them, so it's just, if one didn't work out, I just moved to another one.
And that's exactly what happened on March 17th, 1977, 3 years after he'd killed Catherine Bright. Dennis Rader finally found himself with enough free time away from the wife and kid to put one of his little projects together. He picked up his briefcase full of supplies and put his suit jacket on, completing his disguise of completely forgettable and unassuming man with some sense of importance or authority. He got in his car and drove almost 9 miles south down 135, the furthest he'd ever travel for one of his projects. But when his lead dried up, he pivoted like an absolute pro. After driving this far, nothing was stopping Dennis from enjoying those brief moments of peace away from his wife and screaming toddler. And he was doing something he loved, no less.
That particular day, I drove to Dillon's, parked in the parking lot, watched this particular residence, and then got out of the car and walked over to it. Knocked, nobody answered it. So I was all keyed up, so I just started going through the neighborhood. I'd been into the neighborhood before. I kind of knew a little of the layout of the neighborhood. While I was walking down Hydraulic, I met a young boy and asked him if he ID some pictures. Kind of was a ruse, I guess, a ruse, as you call it. And saw where he went. And I went to another address and knocked on the door. Nobody opened the door, so I just noticed where he went and went to that house, and we went from there.
Dennis was now in full improv mode once again. The 5-year-old boy that he'd spoken to, Steve Relford, was out getting groceries for his sick mother, and had inadvertently led a monster right back to their home. Dennis knocked at 1311 South Hydraulic, presenting himself as a private detective before forcing his way in at gunpoint.
I had the gun here, and I just kind of forced myself in. I just walked in, just opened the door and walked in, and then pulled a pistol.
What gun? What pistol?
357 Magnum. Yeah, I think she was, at that point in time, I think she was sick because she had her night robe on. And I think if I remember right, she had been sick. And I think she came out of the bedroom when I went in the house. I told Miss Diane that I had a problem with sexual fantasies, that I was going to tie her up, and that I might have to tie the kids up.
David lowered the blinds and turned the TV off, gun darting between the sickly mother and her 3 young kids. Dennis assured Shirley Vianne that she would be okay if she just cooperated and that he'd done this before. And then he earned a little bit of goodwill with her by choosing not to tie the kids up and instead locking them in the bathroom with toys and a blanket. He tied the door shut with the rope that he'd brought with him and scooted the bed in front of the door for good measure. 26-year-old Shirley Vianne was still hoping it was just a robbery and told the kids to stay in the bathroom and be quiet. But it was not a robbery at all. The children tried to push out, watching through a crack in the door as Dennis tied their mother to the bed.
Got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then I went ahead and tied her up, and then put a bag over her head and strangled her.
All right. Was this a plastic bag also?
Yes, sir. I think it was.
You say you put a bag over her head and strangled her. What did you strangle her with?
I think on that I had tied her legs to the bedpost and worked up with the rope all the way up, and then what I had left over I looped over her neck.
Again, Dennis Rader would come to completion as he strangled his victim to death without ever penetrating her at all. In fact, he never raped a victim. He saw it as going too far, being taboo. But now, sitting over the lifeless corpse of a middle-aged flu patient, his post-nut clarity kicked in.
Well, the kids were really banging on the door, hollering and screaming, so I cleaned everything up real quick and got out of there, left, and went back into my car.
Now, when you say you cleaned everything...
Well, I mean, put my stuff... I had a briefcase, whatever I had laying around, the ropes, tape, cords, I threw that in there, whatever, that I had that I brought in the house.
Was this a kit that you had prepared?
Yeah, yes, I called my hit kit.
After Dennis had left, the children would eventually force themselves out of the bathroom, too late to help their mother. Once police were on the scene, the kids provided a vague description, but nothing helpful. Police took note of the different knots used. Specific knots, clove hitches on hands or feet, and slip knots for the neck. Internally, the police department were probably already worried that this may be the BTK that had reached out to them. but no public link to a serial killer was made. Again, the murder would pass in and out of the news cycle as another one-off. And after this killing, Dennis would take another little break to let the heat cool down and search for the perfect victim. About 9 months later, Dennis would spot a worthy target. He saw her 25-year-old petite young Nancy Fox walking on the street sometime in 1977 and began to stalk her movements to get a broader picture of her routine. He figured out where she lived and that she lived alone by tailing her as she moved throughout her life. He also discovered that she had a full-time job as a secretary at a local construction company, but she'd also recently picked up a part-time job working nights and weekends at the jewelry store at the mall in order to earn a little extra scratch for the holiday season. During the time he was stalking Nancy, Dennis began to come into the jewelry store and pretend to be a customer in order to interact with and get to know his next victim. Once he felt confident of her schedule, Dennis decided to make his move. On December 8th, 1977, while Nancy Fox was at work at the mall, Dennis went to her home, cut the phone line, and broke in. Then he made himself comfortable while he waited for her to get back. And when she finally did get home after a long day of work, she would be caught off guard by the stranger standing in her kitchen pointing a gun at her. Nancy asked what he wanted, to which Dennis said he had sexual issues and he was there to use her, but if she cooperated, she'd be just fine. The mood was much more relaxed than you'd think. Nancy sat down and talked to him while she smoked a cigarette, eventually agreeing to his terms, saying,
"Let's get this over with so I can call the cops."
After letting her partially undress herself in the bathroom, Dennis took his victim into her bedroom, where he stripped the nightgown off of her, tied her up, and then took his own clothes off. He got on top of her and began to strangle her as he told her exactly who he was.
I'm BTK, and I'm a bad dude.
Nancy squirmed and struggled as the life drained from her eyes, while Dennis Rader came all over the nightgown that he threw off next to the bed. Before leaving, he went through her clothes to take some slips and stockings as trophies and to wear later himself. When he finally got home, he explained his tardiness away by telling his wife that the car was acting up again, but he'd gotten it taken care of. On the way to his job at ADT the next morning, still feeling high from his actions, Dennis took an arrogant risk. To get the attention he craved and pump the BTK fear in the media, he called 911 from a payphone to let them know exactly what he'd done. Police rushed to the address and found Nancy Fox in her home, strangled to death.
We have a homicide that occurred here at 843 South Pershing. We received a call about 8:20 from an individual that said there's a homicide and hung up the phone. And officers came out and we have checked, and we do have a young lady that is a victim of a homicide.
Was she shot or stabbed?
No, she appears to have been strangled this time.
Dennis Rader's risky and downright pathetic attention-seeking efforts continued on January 31st, 1978, when he decided to send an index card bearing a poem to the Wichita Eagle. Surely locks, wilt thou be mine? Unaware of the connection to Shirley Vian and believing it to be a Valentine's Day note, the mail clerk forwarded the card to the paper's classified ad department. And because the serious nature of the poem seemed to go over everybody's head, Dennis sent a much more direct 2-page letter to the Wichita TV station Cake TV. In it, the author takes responsibility for the murders of Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, as well as another unnamed victim.
How many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention?
And then, as if to try to suck any badassness away from himself for his actions, he suggested nicknames for himself, including the BTK Strangler, the Wichita Hangman, and the Asphyxiator.
What is this that I can see? Cold icy hands taking hold of me. For death has come, you all can see. All has opened its gate to trick me. Oh, death. Oh, death. Can't you spare me over for another year? I'll stuff your jaw so you can't talk. I'll blind your legs so you can't walk. I'll tie your hands so you can't make a stand. In front of me, I'll close your eyes so you can't see. I'll bring sexual death unto you from me.
In response, it was decided that the public should finally be made aware of what was happening. On February 10th, 1978, a hastily set up news conference with Police Chief Richard Lemunion was aired on Cake TV.
Executive producer Ron Lewin received the letter. He's with us today to give us the information. Ron?
Jack, the communication came in the form of a 2-page typewritten letter addressed to KAKE Channel 10. It was signed with the initials BTK. BTK claims to have strangled a total of 7 women. 7 people, mostly women. He provided a list of his victims, beginning with the number 5. BTK has killed 7 people, Chief. What kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all. We have general leads, we have circumstantial evidence, we have absolutely nothing that will point us to any one particular individual. The most important thing that everyone can do is certainly be aware that we do have a very serious problem. You're dealing with a person who is perverted, a person that is sick. That person is going to kill again.
Dennis absolutely loved that he was finally getting the attention he felt he deserved. 200,000 people in Wichita were now aware of the BTK Killer.
I knew they would say something about it on TV. BTK sent us a letter. That was an extremely big high, I can tell you that.
But attention is a double-edged sword. While the community's fear made people cautious and paranoid, it made police motivated and persistent. It wasn't long until investigators managed to tie Dennis's communications to 2 specific Xerox machines. You see, in order to avoid forensic evidence, Dennis would type a letter and Xerox it several times to degrade the details that could be used as evidence. But those machines left enough of their own fingerprints to trace the letters back. One of them was a copy machine in the basement of Wichita State University, and the other was on the 2nd floor of the public library, where the original Otero letter was found. Dennis Rader was a lot of things, and I mean a lot, but an idiot wasn't one. Sure, he let his indulgences put him at risk from time to time, but they were calculated risks. As soon as he heard that police had connected BTK to WSU, where he was still attending classes, he decided that he'd use multiple copiers from different locations for any letter he'd send in the future. Maybe he thirsted for this attention so much because he knew that he'd be going on hiatus. After all, his wife was pregnant with their 2nd child. Maybe he wasn't sure that he would ever kill again, and he wanted his actions to resonate the way he thought they should have. Or maybe his look-at-me behavior was actually a huge overstep, and the police response he thought that he wanted actually scared the shit out of him, especially now that he was having a daughter of his own. It is hard to know what exactly was going through Dennis Rader's head at the time, but by all accounts, he was a loving, generous, and doting father to little Carrie, who was born in 1978. I think there was an internal struggle going on in Dennis's head, between what he wanted, his desires, his passions, and what he knew he needed to do in order to maintain his appearance as an everyman and a good father. I say this because Dennis clearly wanted to continue killing, but something made him walk away from a kill on April 28, 1979. On that day, he'd broken into another home at 615 South Pinecrest, and he was waiting there for the 63-year-old homeowner, Anna Williams, or her daughter, to return home.
What I was trying to do was get more notches on my gun at that time. So I was in the mood. I had everything set. I had my hit kit, had rope, tape. I had 2 guns, a couple of knives. I was going to do something.
But something made him give up. He got up and he left after taking a few items. But Dennis, needing attention and wanting credit for things that he didn't even follow through with, Dennis decided that he was going to send his near victim, Anna Williams, a little package to let her know just how fucking lucky she was. In it were several personal items that he'd yoinked from her house, along with a poem titled, "Oh Anna, why didn't you appear?" Even though it had been well over a year since BTK's last kill, the Wichita police hadn't forgotten about their pen pal. But admittedly, they didn't have much to go on. So in August of 1979, seeking help from the public, they released the recording of BTK's December 1977 911 call.
Dispatcher? Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Park.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address?
843 South Pershing. That's correct.
They hoped that somebody would recognize the voice, and police did receive 110 tips during the first day of the broadcast. But there were 110 lemons, because not a single one of them or any of the tips that followed provided any relevant information. Feeling the heat from the investigation that was going more and more public, Dennis took a step back from his projects, but he never stopped hunting. He was always keeping his eye out for new potential victims.
The fantasy world was always right there, not very far away. I could switch gears and move into one and move out of the other very quickly.
But without actually killing, he needed to find new ways to fulfill his strange desires. He cut out pictures of models and pieced them together on 3x5 note cards, named them, talked to them, jerked off to them. But his methods for getting himself off would need to become more extreme, as we'll soon see. In 1979, Dennis Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a major in administration of justice. After graduating, he tried to become a law enforcement agent of some kind, applying with the Wichita Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, and the Highway Patrol, all of which turned him away. But this didn't mean that he didn't put his knowledge to use. Every one of the 4 crime scenes that Dennis left behind were completely clean. No fingerprints, no hair, nothing at all to tie Dennis to his crimes. Nothing in his letters that he sent offered anything either. He thought of himself as a smarter person than the people around him, including the police. And every time he killed or communicated with the press without a break in the case, he became more confident. Years passed as Dennis worked for ADT, raised a family, and maintained his disguise. But as time continued to advance, so did the forensic science that police used. So in 1984, a task force called the Ghostbusters Task Force was formed. They would look into newly developed DNA testing, computer database searches, and psychological profiling. But even with all their new toys, Dennis hadn't left enough behind.
Yes, I was very careful with the forensics. I made sure I didn't leave my fingerprints. I wore rubber gloves, ones that you use when you're washing dishes.
By 1985, Dennis Rader's cool-down period was coming to an end. The dull day-to-day repetition of being the active family man was growing tiresome. He had stayed clear of murder by staying focused on his family and maintaining a facade of a trustworthy community figure, but he could only pretend the Impossible Burger was good for so long. You might say the vegan-like cope was whittling away the vigor and liveliness of the man who he was before, and he was ready for a fucking Big Mac. He chose his next victim carefully and planned his return to the game well. After 7 years dormant, oddly it would be his 53-year-old neighbor Maureen Hedge who would get his imagination wound up enough to get him back in. Miss Hedge was an older woman who lived alone, had no dog, and seemed like an easy target for Rader. He saw her on his walks in the neighborhood and would wave to her while he imagined his hands around her throat. And while the choice was a risky one, he took precautions to distance himself from the area and to have a strong alibi. You see, during that long hiatus, Dennis had really been ingraining himself into his community. By giving his time and showing initiative in organizations like his church and the local Boy Scouts troop, he had put himself in positions of power by gaining the trust of people around him. He did so much work for his local church that he was entrusted with a key so that he could come and go as he needed. Dennis Rader's son was also about 10 years old at this point, and Dennis was heavily involved in his life, especially with Boy Scouts. He was actually the troop's volunteer troop leader, and a very active one at that. So when Dennis decided it was time to kill again, he would cleverly take full advantage of these positions that he'd earned himself, as we'll soon see. The night that Dennis decided to strike down Maureen Hedge was that of April 27th, 1985. It was a pleasant evening, which was great because Dennis Rader's Boy Scout troop had a campout planned for the night. After they'd set up camp, they probably fished and sat around a campfire, quizzed each other on state capitals and knots, whatever Boy Scouts do. Dennis did everything that a good scout leader does. But after eventually shooing the kids away from a dwindling campfire off to their tents for the night, it was time for Dennis to do what a good scout leader shouldn't. Once everything was wound down, Dennis told the other chaperones that he needed to go take care of something. He said he would be back shortly, and the others agreed to cover his responsibilities until he returned. From there, Dennis would drive to a bowling alley at Woodlawn and 21st Street. He changed into bowling clothes and walked in with a bowling bag that contained his hit kit. Dennis sat down at the bar and ordered a beer before calling a cab. After swishing the beer around his mouth a little bit, he loaded into his cab, pretending to be drunk after a long night of bowling with the boys. He had the driver drop him off in his neighborhood. It was just a short walk down Independent Street from his house to Maureen Hedges. As he approached, he was caught off guard. According to everything he knew about her patterns, she shouldn't be here right now, but her car was in the driveway. Perplexed, he cautiously approached the house to investigate. It appeared to be empty, so he carried on with his plan, cutting the phone line and breaking in. He found that the house was indeed empty, but almost immediately he heard a car pull up and a car door shut. Dennis, not knowing what to expect, hid in Maureen's bedroom as her and her guest walked into the house. Maureen Hedge had actually been on a date that night. Her and her boyfriend had been out playing bingo and having dinner. and they were now spending the next hour and a half winding down while Dennis hid and remained quiet. Eventually, Maureen's boyfriend left and went home, and Maureen went to bed. And that's when Dennis decided he'd sneak out from the crevice he'd been hiding in. Dennis quietly crept around the bedroom, but he couldn't see shit because it was so dark. He managed to locate the switch for the nearby bathroom light and switched it on. The two neighbors' eyes met, and Maureen screamed as Dennis hopped on top of her and quickly strangled her to death with his bare hands. Once she was dead, though, Dennis decided he wasn't done having fun with her just yet. He stripped her, tied up her dead body, and wrapped her in a blanket before stuffing her in the trunk of her own car. He drove her to Christ Lutheran Church, where he was a governing member. He used his keys to gain access and took his model down to the basement for a very special photo shoot. He staged her body in several forms of bondage and took photos of it all. Once the photo shoot was done, he loaded the corpse back into the trunk. He locked up and headed out to find a good place to dump the body. Dennis drove east on 53rd until he found a low ditch with overhanging tree cover. He quickly stopped and threw Maureen Hedges' body into the ditch and covered it with brush he found lying around the area, and then he took off. Dennis parked his dead neighbor's car at the bowling alley, got in his own car, and drove back to complete his obligations with the Boy Scouts troop. The following day, a welfare check was called for Maureen when she did not show up for work. When her and her car could not be located, the police put in a missing persons report. Several days later, on May 2nd, police would locate Maureen Hedges' car at the bowling alley. The next day, her purse would be found near 143rd East and 37th North. And finally, on May 5th, 1985, Maureen Hedges' body would be found.
A dead dog there, and then right beside, raised a little further, was a foot.
The body was nude and police say badly decomposed. A pair of knotted pantyhose were found lying in the ditch beside it. The body was discovered here at 53rd Street North, just east of Webb Road, a bit west of the area that police had been searching all weekend for some clue to the disappearance of 53-year-old Maureen Hedge.
Although the phone line was cut like BTK had done in the past, his absence in recent years and the fact that Maureen Hedges' body had been dumped somewhere were enough for police not to investigate it as a part of the BTK killings. Dennis would also manage to avoid bragging to the police or writing any letters this time. For over a year, Dennis would sit back, say nothing, and live his life, while the police spun their tires trying to figure out what was going on. It wasn't until September of 1986 that Dennis decided to strike again. While driving around one day on an early lunch break, Dennis spotted Vicki Wegerly coming out of her house at 2404 West 13th Street, and he snapped into action. 28-year-old Vicki had caught the eye of Dennis many times before. She'd been one of his projects for a while. Dennis already had a set of hit clothes in his car, as he calls them, a ready-to-go disguise that he could get rid of later. Dennis quickly found a place to park and disguised himself as a phone repairman. He put on a helmet adorned with a phone symbol sticker, attached his tool belt full of what looked like phone equipment, and then Dennis the phone guy drove back to Vicki Wegerly's neighborhood, parked, and walked over to her house carrying a briefcase. As he walked around the property pretending to be on official business, he could hear dogs barking in the backyard and noticed that all the windows were open. Not the best things when planning to bind, torture, and kill, but Dennis pushed forward nonetheless. He approached the front door and knocked, before warmly greeting Vicki and identifying himself as a phone company employee. He explained that he needed to quickly check her home phone equipment because of some problem with the line. Nervous about the intrusion but not wanting to be a bother, Vicki agreed to let him do his job and said that her husband would be home soon for lunch. Vicki's baby was playing on the floor in the front room. Vicki was doing her best to tend to her child while also keeping a close eye on the strange repairman fiddling with the house phone. Dennis had no idea if her husband was really going to show, but he decided it was worth the risk. As Dennis waited on his moment to strike, Vicki turned to check on her 2-year-old son. Dennis used the moment to rush her with a pistol. At gunpoint, he ordered her back into her bedroom and tried to tie up his captive. In his rush, Dennis grabbed whatever he could in the room to tie up Vicki Wegerly. The hurried knots made of sheet or t-shirt were, well, let's just say Dennis's Boy Scout troop would have been ashamed. Vicki managed to break loose from her bondage and fight back, but in the end, Dennis would overpower her, pin her down, and strangle her with the sock until she stopped moving. Still not knowing if her husband may arrive at any second, Dennis quickly pulled out his Polaroid camera from the briefcase and rearranged Vicki's body a few times for some pictures. He stole Vicki's car keys and packed everything back into the suitcase before stealing her car to make his narrow escape. Bill Wegerly, the husband, said that he saw his own car going the opposite direction of the house, but he couldn't identify the driver. While Dennis was ditching the car a couple blocks away, Bill was arriving at his house. Vicky's car was missing, which was strange for this time of day. Cautiously, he approached the house, calling for his wife as he entered. He searched around, seeing that their infant had been left unattended. He then walked back into his bedroom where he saw that the bed was not made, and Vicky always made sure that the bed was made every morning. Finally, he walked around the edge of the bed, where he saw Vicky's body tucked under the bed with a sock noose around her neck. Bill pulled her out as soon as he could and took it off, and somehow Vicky was still clinging to life.
By the time police got to Vicky Wegerle's house on West 13th, her heart had already stopped beating. She died within 15 minutes at Riverside Hospital. Her husband, Bill, supposedly found Vicky with a noose around her neck.
By this time, Dennis had retrieved his own car and returned to work without anybody suspecting him of a thing. Police couldn't scrape together much of anything for evidence at the Wegerle house, so they focused their attention on recently widowed Bill Wegerle in the months and years to follow. Stressed out and broken, Bill failed 2 lie detector tests, the first given by the police and the second one by a polygraph expert that he had hired himself. He was named the prime suspect, but police never had enough to actually charge Bill or anybody else with Vicky's murder. But the rumors persisted for years in the community, making life hard on Bill and his son. In 1988, Dennis lost his job with ADT and started working for the Census Bureau, where he would travel to other states. Before these trips, Dennis would dig into the hidey holes they had all over his property, filled with victims' possessions, ropes, masks, and other autoerotic items.
And then I had hidey holes underneath the house, crawl space, and I had hidey holes up in the attic.
He packed them up with the rest of his luggage, giddy with anticipation. During his time away from his family, he could indulge a little bit. On his work trips, he would indulge in what he called motel parties, where he would use dolls or dress himself up in clothing that he'd stolen from victims and partake in autoerotic bondage play. He liked it so much that eventually, doing it while he was on the road wasn't enough. He became careless and started to do these things at home, and he was doing it so often that twice his wife came home and walked in on him. She was so disgusted by what she saw that after the second time, she threatened to take the kids and leave him if he ever did it again. Dennis Rader was a real monster, there's no doubt about that, but he hid it very well. An insidious, sadistic sociopath with an unmatched ability to embed himself in the fabric of the Park City community that he'd been hunting for over 15 years. To be so utterly banal and unassuming as to fade into his environment like some sort of satanic sex pest chameleon, to earn the trust and respect of those around him, his family, his church, community, co-workers, neighbors, and local government, and draw no suspicion of any kind, to pass by completely unnoticed while for years having to cope with these dark desires by sneaking away from your family at night, to dress up in his victim's panties and strangle himself while taking pictures like this one. Well, it's both incredibly impressive and the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. For years, Dennis maintained and manicured his persona, staying personally and emotionally invested in his family, his career, and his other obligations. But creatures like Dennis Rader don't stop killing because life gets in the way. At best, they go through cooldown periods, often finding temporary relief from their bloodlust by substituting it with another antisocial act of depravity that provides a similar feeling of getting away with it. Between his 9th victim, Vicky Wegerle, and his 10th, Dennis abstained from killing for over 4 years. The dress up and hang out masturbatography hour seemed to do the trick for Dennis during those years, and were probably some of the most terrifying jerk-off sessions that you could ever imagine. But when you have the violent sexual needs that he does, playing with your toys alone isn't a permanent solution. Sooner or later, he's gonna get bored. In 1991, Dennis became a compliance officer in Park City, Kansas. It wasn't a police officer, but it was something, I guess. He would now be spending his days trolling Park City looking for overgrown lawns, inoperable cars, and stray pets. For years, trolling was a luxury that Dennis just had less and less time for. Even during his most active years of killing, scouting potential projects had been done on commutes to class or school, lunch breaks, and to and fro errands and honeydews that would get him away from the wife and kids. Sure, Dennis Rader's new compliance officer position didn't come with a gun or the power of an actual police officer, but now he'd be getting paid to spend his days patrolling his old hunting grounds, with the symbol of authority on the side of his car, and that was enough to get 45-year-old Rader rock hard. 62-year-old Dolores Davis, better known as Dee, would be the last confirmed victim of Dennis Rader. She lived just a mile and a half from Dennis's home, where he had spotted her making his rounds one day. Dennis, now a man approaching 50, saw Dolores as the perfect opponent for his late career exhibition bout. Her being a bit on the older side, Dennis had learned throughout the years, meant that she wouldn't put up as much of a fight. And with his soft target locked in, Dennis Rader cleverly planned to take action on the evening of January 19, 1991, during a weekend that his Boy Scouts troop had planned to camp out. That evening, Dolores had gone out on a dinner date with somebody that she'd been seeing, but had gotten home early and was in bed by 10 after her date left. Around this time, Dennis would make up an excuse to leave the campsite and drive to his parents' house, where he would quickly change from his scout uniform into his hit kit. He drove to the Park City Baptist Church, where he would leave his car and continue to 6226 North Hillside on foot. When he arrived sometime before midnight, Dennis charged in like Leroy Jenkins. After 4 long years of waiting for this, he didn't give a shit about being sneaky, cutting phone lines, none of his usual precautions. Instead, he let his base desires take the wheel, making him sloppy. He grabbed a nearby cinder block and chunked it through the sliding glass patio door. Dolores, woken by the sound, rushed out to find Dennis standing there with a gun. Like times before, Dennis told his victim that he was on the run from the police and just needed a car and some spending cash. Dolores agreed to let Dennis tie her up in the bedroom while he made his escape, hoping the home intruder would keep his word. But as soon as Dennis had her bound and gagged, Dolores Davis's fatal decision to trust him would become clear as he began strangling her with a pair of her own pantyhose. Dennis wasted no time in getting the job done. He knew he had to get away from the messy crime scene, and he was working against the clock in order to get back to the Boy Scout camp. Dennis found Dolores' keys and hastily loaded her body into the trunk of her own car. He then drove to a lake near Park City and hid the body in his hit kit underneath some low-hanging branches from a nearby tree. And while hiding all of his supplies next to the corpse of Miss Davis, he noticed that one of his guns was missing.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
I took her car back to her house. In the interim, I realized that I had lost one of my guns. I dropped it somewhere. So we started trying to figure out where my gun was. So I went back in the house, realized I had dropped it when I broke the plate glass window. It dropped and fell on the floor right there, and I found it right there.
Dropping his personal firearm while smashing through a plate glass window like BTK stood for Big Talking Kool-Aid Man perfectly demonstrates how careless and sloppy Dennis Rader was that night. He wiped the place down for fingerprints, collected a few keepsakes from Dolores' house, before throwing her car keys on top of her house and starting his walk back to his car. From there, he'd drive back to where he ditched the body in his hit kit. He collected his things and again threw Dolores' body in a trunk before driving down a country road to a secluded bridge in Sedgwick County. There, near 117th North and Meridian, Dennis chunked the body of his 10th victim under the bridge and drove back to camp. While Dennis was probably leading a hike the next day or roasting marshmallows with his troop, Dolores' boyfriend was filing a missing persons report after he couldn't get a hold of her. Police went to her house only to find the back door smashed, jewelry stolen, and the owner missing. An APB was put out to find anybody who looked suspicious and had the means. Dennis was safely at camp all day, avoiding the prying eyes of police. But his dirty urges would get the best of him once again. The feelings he got from being BTK were intoxicating, and that night, he carelessly snuck out of camp for the second night in a row to go spend time with the body and take some photographs that he could remember his work by. And all of that went fairly smoothly. Once he'd gotten the pictures and the high that he needed that night, he headed back towards camp without a worry in the world. But Dennis's celebration was cut short as he pulled off at a rest stop to change his clothes back to his scout camp gear and walked right into a state trooper looking for anybody that could have had something to do with the death of Dolores Davis. The trooper stopped Dennis, noticing that he looked far too clean and out of place for this rest stop in the middle of the night. The cop asked him what he was doing out and about, and Dennis froze. Sitting just outside in his car were photos of Dolores Davis's corpse, a box of her jewelry, and his hit kit. Dennis Rader managed to keep his cool and bumbled on about how he was running an errand and on the way back to the Boy Scout camp. The trooper looked him up and down and decided he was telling the truth. Dennis Rader was free to go about his night. Once again, his humdrum, meek demeanor had perfectly concealed the hideous monster hiding just below the surface. On February 1st, 1991, 13 days after her death, Dolores' body would be found.
Investigators say a 15-year-old boy discovered the body early this morning while he was walking his dog. Investigators here on the scene are not giving any details as to what condition the body was found in, but at this time, they are treating this case as a homicide.
And though efforts were made to bring Miss Davis justice, it seemed there was just too little to go off of. And because of Dennis's uncharacteristic actions that night, there was no reason for investigators to believe that BTK was involved. And then, nothing. BTK seemed to have vanished. The small community had gotten used to BTK killing every year or two. But as months turned to years without communication or any crimes linked to BTK, the residents of Wichita remained in fear, wondering when he would strike again. From 1974 to 1991, Dennis Rader had killed 10 people within a small Park City community. He found every one of his victims within an 8.5-mile radius of where Dennis laid his head at night. Rader didn't necessarily intend to retire at this moment, but life just kinda got away on him. Dennis took his new role as Park City compliance supervisor seriously, claiming to have revamped the program by setting up new animal control laws and enforcing them, and setting up professional standards and training. Rader had to be fingerprinted for the position, which terrified him. He knew he'd been careful, but knowing his prints were now in the system was something he had to take into account. As Dennis's children grew into more independent teenagers, he and his wife Paula became more involved in the church, assisting with charity work and lending a hand with the maintenance. Although Dennis would say he was always on the prowl, he said later that the urge was kind of gone after Dolores Davis. He was busy with work, family, church, and other obligations, and his bloodlust seemed to be satisfied. He was content to getting off the Polaroids that he'd taken of his victims and trophies that he'd lifted from the scene, collages of women that he'd cut up from smut magazines that he put together and talked to on the way to work. As the years passed, his needs seemed to simplify, and he was okay with it because he felt that his record would speak for itself, that BTK would go down as one of the worst that ever got away with it. He believed he would watch his legacy go down in infamy, and he followed the news of serial killers closely in anticipation. Dennis was just as fascinated with them as he was when he was a child, but now he looked at the subject a little differently. He judged every serial killer story against his own, now looking upon their press coverage with jealousy, believing that the BTK name didn't get the national attention that it deserved. Ted Bundy's execution in 1989 was huge news. In 1991, the world would learn about the cannibal murderer Jeffrey Dahmer. Every time the news discussed one of these other fascinating and terrifying serial killers, Dennis could feel his own legacy becoming less relevant. But for now, that was alright. Dennis was busy living his second life to the fullest. In 1993, Dennis helped his son create the Park City Directory as a part of an Eagle Scout service project. In 1996, Rader's dedication to his job led to the county commissioner recommending him for the Sedgwick County Animal Control Advisory Board, where he was appointed a seat. He would resign from his role there in 1998 while continuing to stay dedicated to his community and his work. That hard work would be acknowledged in October of 2001 when Park City Mayor Emil Bergquist presented Dennis with an award for 10 years of service. Also in 2001, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, was caught. Dennis was especially interested in the story because he was caught with the use of DNA. And for the first time in a long time, Dennis was scared of being caught. He knew that he had left semen at the Otero crime scene and the Nancy Fox crime scene. Also, in the fight for her life, Vicky Wegerle had managed to scratch Dennis across the face, leaving his DNA under her fingernail. And Dennis was right to be scared because a new investigating team led by Lieutenant Kenneth Landwehr had been going over open cases that could be tied to BTK. They knew of at least 7, but suspected it could be twice as many. 23-year-old Sherry Baker was a student at WSU, murdered in November of 1974. She was found bound with a telephone cord, gagged, and stabbed to death on the floor of her apartment. There was no signs of forced entry. 26-year-old Denise Rathbun lived just 1 block north of the Oteros and disappeared on November 26, 1977, while walking home from the laundromat. The body of Nancy Fox was found the day before. On June 29, 1985, someone killed 31-year-old Linda Shawn Casey in her North Spruce Street apartment. The killer had gagged her and bound her hands behind her back before brutally stabbing her to death. She'd also been beaten repeatedly in the face and across the head with a wine bottle, and the phone line had been cut using the murder weapon. Police were beginning to suspect BTK in these and many other unsolved cases from the area. Some officers already had theories that the deaths of Maureen Hedge and Dolores Davis were at the hands of BTK. Dennis knew that as science and technology progressed, the investigators hunting him would look back on his crimes with fresh eyes and new tools. Still, Dennis carried on pretty unbothered. In 2003, Dennis's daughter would be married. Dennis would proudly walk her down the aisle with all the love and adoration that you'd expect from a human being. Sometime around 2004, Dennis Rader had his last motel party in Dodge City. He dusted off his murder memorabilia, reclaimed panties, and ball gag for one last hoorah. He'd officially decided to hang it up and would begin the nostalgic task of purging his hidey holes of his dirty little treasures. He was burning the evidence, journals, photos, personal belongings of the victims. He was burying his legacy. Not that it should be destroyed, but rather that after his death, it could be resurrected in full like a morbid time capsule of secrets. Before tossing anything away, he would digitally document his most incriminating items and store them on his computer. And because Dennis was using his work's copier, computer, and other office equipment needed for the archival goals, he was often driving around with these things or leaving them at work. Dennis Rader still believed that he couldn't be caught, and he fantasized about living out his natural life suspicion and consequence-free, getting away with it all, and having the truth dropped in full on the world once he was gone. It was his way of showing that he'd won, of rubbing it in everyone's face. But on January 17th, 2004, something would happen that would change Dennis's plans. On that day, the Wichita Eagle published a story by Hearst Labiana. It was a 30th anniversary retrospective of the Otero killings and the associated BTK murders. It mentioned that not many locals were even aware of the Otero murders. It had been 26 years since BTK's last confirmed kill, Nancy Fox, in 1977. The article suggested that BTK may be dead or in prison somewhere, and the once ever-present cloud of fear that had lingered over the community might be lifting. It also paid lip service to a local author named Robert Beatty, who would be telling the story of the BTK murders in his upcoming book. Dennis had grown content of leaving the BTK mantle behind at this point, but he was willing to do so assuming that he had control of his legacy. The article was an insult to him, and he hated the idea of some local author dipshit nobody getting any attention for telling Dennis's story. 2 months went by while he tossed and turned over his legacy, turning to dust before his eyes. His ego couldn't handle the hit, and he decided that he was coming out of hiding. On March 19, 2004, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. It was addressed to Labiana, the author of the original BTK article. The return address was to a Bill Thomas Kilman of 1684 South Old Manor, Wichita. The address was just an abandoned property, but the initials BTK were a cute little clue for authorities. But if that wasn't clear enough, he signed it with the now familiar BTK signature. The letter was postmarked March 17th, the anniversary of Shirley Vianne's 1977 murder. Inside was a photocopy of Vicki Weekerly's driver's license, and 3 photocopies of Polaroids of a victim's body appearing to be Vicki. BTK was toying with the police, and to top it all off, he added a German fractional code to his letter that, when solved, spelled, "Let Beatty know" for his book. The photos of Weegerly lying motionless on the floor were deemed legitimate. They could only have been taken by the killer, as Vicki was rushed to the hospital before she died. The letter linked the unsolved murder conclusively with BTK and announced the return of the Wichita Strangler. This communication was the start of a dangerous cat and mouse game between Rader and the police. Dennis chose to send photos of Vicki Weekerly knowing that there was DNA evidence under her nails, an arrogant display of confidence that he would never be caught. The Wichita Eagle ran a story letting the people know that BTK had reached out and taken credit for an 8th victim.
Tonight, Wichitans are on edge. The serial killer who terrorized Wichita for years causes new fears.
About a 2-decade-old homicide linked to BTK that only the killer would know.
The story was huge news and would break into the national news cycle in no time.
BTK is communicating again.
BTK is back.
BTK.
BTK.
And it added new life to the fear of BTK in Wichita.
Maybe he's a little closer. It's stressful. Could be the guy next door. I have no clue.
59-year-old Dennis was thrilled with the news coverage and felt vindicated. This was the attention that he thought his story deserved all along. And the rush of toying with the police and the media like some kind of puppet master was intoxicating. He also felt that it gave more meaning to all of his trophies that he was already getting rid of. Instead of burning them, he would include them in packages, clues, riddles, and puzzles. The Wichita hangman had aged into some kind of sex pest riddler, and as pathetic as it seems, Dennis was living his best life. He was once again getting the kind of rush that killing once gave him. Dennis would send his next little puzzle package to his favorite TV station. Cake TV received an envelope from a Thomas B. Killman.
When we opened it up, we weren't sure what we would find inside, and of course the contents looked very suspicious.
The police were called, and in no time a detective arrived to retrieve the letter to see if it contains the clues needed to track down BTK.
Inside was a complex full-page word puzzle, rough photocopies of 2 fake ID badges that Dennis would use in his disguises, and a piece of paper titled The BTK Story, with an altered list of chapter titles from a crime library's feature story on the BTK case, which had been the only BTK feature story on the internet at the time. Chapter 8's title, Mo ID Ruse, referred to the 2 fake photocopied IDs that Dennis included in the package. It was his MO, or modus operandi, to use disguises and fake credentials to gain access to his victims. The puzzle spelled out words like prowl, fantasies, and online puzzle sleuths would later say that RADER are grouped right around the number 6220, Dennis's street address. But I don't really see it, and Dennis would later say that if it is there, it was completely by accident.
A letter received by Cake TV was turned over to us last Wednesday, and we are treating it as possibly being sent by BTK.
Dennis decided he would go hide his next care package of clues in the wild for anybody to find, just like kids and autistic people do with painted rocks. Dennis called it a fieldgram. On June 13th, 2004, a man on his way to work would find something odd indeed. A brown envelope with BTK fieldgram written on it contained 3 photocopied pieces of paper, Chapter 2 of the BTK story, and Death on a Cold January Morning, misspelled. The letter contained graphic details about the murder of the Otero family, who he killed in January of 1974. The letter also contained a picture of a nude bound woman hanging from a rope. The drawing was captioned, "The sexual thrill is my bill." And Dennis was having so much fun doing this. Can you imagine a 60-year-old man spending hours making puzzles? It's kind of a cute thing if you forget a bunch of the context. His next communication was on July 17th, 2004. A letter was found in a mechanical engineering textbook that was left in the drop box of the Wichita Public Library. It was immediately handed over to the police, who later confirmed it to be a genuine BTK communication. And while the letter was real, the contents within were nothing more than a wild goose chase. BTK was claiming responsibility for a Sumner County teenager that was found dead and tied to the train tracks. Police would later determine that BTK had nothing to do with the death, and ruled it a suicide somehow. Dennis had seen some of the press on the case and decided to use it as a red herring in his little game. The letter also hinted at Dennis's next potential kill, a latchkey kid. Dennis wanted to get to the police, mess with them, but this threat inspired a whole new level of vigor. On October 22nd, a suspicious letter was left at the UPS drop box outside of the Omni Center building on Kansas Street in Wichita. The letter was discovered on the 30th anniversary of BTK's first ever communication with the authorities. The manila envelope contained BTK's biography, more pictures, and a list of names. Many of the details in the biography were true, but much of it was flat out falsehoods. Knowing that this was probably the case, the Wichita police still held a press conference on November 30th, 2004, where they offered a great deal of background information that BTK had supplied about his life.
BTK has sent numerous communications to the media and the police. In these letters, he has provided certain background information about himself, which he claims is accurate.
The next BTK fieldgram would be found mid-December 2004 by a man walking through Wichita's Murdoch Park. He stumbled upon a suspicious white garbage bag wrapped in rubber bands. The man took the bag home and looked inside, and it contained a letter, Nancy Fox's driver's license, and a Barbie doll with a hood over its head and arms tied behind its back. The bag was turned over to investigators who examined its contents. The letter was similar to the one found earlier in May 2004, which had a chapter list that was taken from the Crime Library online story, but for some reason this time chapters 1, 2, and 8 were left blank. On January 25th, 2005, a postcard was sent to Cake TV. The return on it was 803 North Edgemore, the home of the Otero family. The postcard directed police to 69th and Seneca Street, where they would find a Post Toasties box weighted down with a brick against the street sign. The Post Toasties cereal box was meant to signify Dennis's serial killer status. He was literally out here sending dad jokes to the police. The T in Toasties had been circled with a Sharpie, with B written above it and K written below. Inside the box was another doll fashioned in a death position and tied to a pipe, a recreation of one of his earliest and most brutal killings of Josephine Otero. Also included were journal entries by BTK of some of his earliest killings, as well as some jewelry that he'd taken off victims. The postcard that had tipped them off to the cereal box contained another clue, however. It had also inquired about communication number 7, which apparently had been dropped off at the local Home Depot on January 8th. After poking around the store, investigators learned that one employee had found a special case cereal box in the bed of his pickup truck. Inside were a blue beaded necklace and a few pages of writing. The man who had found it said he threw it away, but he was happy to let police retrieve it from his garbage. Inside the pages of writing recovered were a description of the BTK lair, a 3-story kill house with an elevator and bondage room. Also included was a detailed list of BTK's projects. Last was a naive request by BTK asking if he could communicate via a computer floppy disk without being traced. If so, the police were instructed to run a newspaper ad with the message, "Rex, it will be okay." The Home Depot store surveillance cameras showed a man stop and drop off the package in the truck, but it was too far away and too blurry to be identifiable.
Police say they are still receiving tips and want the public to continue to call the BTK tip line. The number 268.
With momentum on their side and seeing an opportunity to get BTK to slip up, arrangements were made between authorities and the Wichita Eagle. They agreed to run 3 ads between January 28th and March 3rd, the first being exactly what Dennis requested, and the second 2 catering to Dennis's sexual deviance. All 3 ads would run, but Dennis, being an eager beaver, would jump at the first one, and on February 3rd, Dennis would confirm that he got the message via another postcard to Cake TV. And now police just had to sit back and wait on their ageist attack on 60-year-old Dennis Rader's computer literacy to take hold. And on February 16, 2005, that's exactly what happened. KSAS receives communication number 11 from BTK. Rader's hubris and ignorance that were his downfall would arrive in a manila envelope. Inside, a floppy disk. The disk was quickly handed over to forensic computer scientists, who quickly discovered that files had last been saved by a Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church and Park City Library. Within seconds, a quick internet search for Christ Lutheran Church revealed the name of its president, Dennis Rader. This was probably enough to take Dennis down, but Lieutenant Landwehr wanted to be sure. Already armed with DNA evidence carefully preserved by the Ghostbusters task force, Landwehr searched for ways to tie it directly to Dennis Rader. When he learned that Dennis's daughter Carrie had annual pap smears at her college's medical center, he knew that a familial DNA match would be enough to get Dennis by the balls. A search warrant for her medical records was obtained to gain access to DNA samples for testing. And just like that, they had him. On February 25, 2005, while heading home from his office to have lunch with his wife, Dennis Rader was pulled over.
They had helicopters and all kinds of stuff around. Anyway, when I pulled off to go down this side street, they were all lined up on the street, and I thought, what are they there for? Could it be me? And then as soon as they appeared in the rear mirror, I knew, I couldn't figure out how they knew.
As a swarm of police cars came from every direction, helicopters buzzed overhead as Dennis was dragged from the car. And that's when he realized he'd been lied to, that the floppy disk had brought him down.
I first thought they made the connection when I dropped off my floppy in a mailbox, and that what really threw me, because how could they figure that with no cameras or anything? So I thought I could get out of it. And I wasn't really too nervous about it. I sent a lot of stuff to the mail and didn't have any feedback or any kickbacks from it. I guess I got confidence that they were sort of buddies or something, or friends. I kind of had a little bonding with Landwehr. I think I kind of bonded with him. Thought they were wanting to play cat and mouse with me, which they were, but I thought they would be truthful. I talked to Mr. Landwehr. He said, you know why you're going downtown? And I said, I've got an idea. I think that tipped it off right there.
Before being taken downtown, Dennis asked that somebody go to his house and tell his wife that he wouldn't be home for lunch. Dennis would be interrogated and confronted with the DNA evidence.
They talked about the DNA, so nowhere along the line was they going to be able to escape that. So that was the final link. I was caught with anything else to do, to be honest.
Yes, you guys know.
What else?
Say who you are.
Today is a very historic day. The bottom line, BTK is arrested.
On March 1st, 2005, Dennis Rader would be charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder related to BTK, 3 public defenders would be assigned to his case. On April 19, 2005, Dennis Rader would waive his right to a preliminary hearing, with the defense acknowledging that the state possessed enough evidence to send the case to trial. 2 weeks later, on May 3rd, Sedgwick County District Judge Greg Waller would enter a not guilty plea for Dennis Rader, whose public defender said that their client would stand mute on the 10 charges of first-degree murder. But less than 2 months later, on June 27th, Dennis Rader would surprise the courts by pleading guilty to all 10 counts. With the mountains of evidence against him and the complete lack of a defense, the only thing Dennis and his legal team could do was cooperate. Dennis, who likely had a hand in one or several of the open cases that he was suspected of being involved in, would also benefit by shutting the fuck up and letting police close the case. You see, the 10 murders that Dennis was accused of between 1973 and 1991 fit nicely in a legal window, because in 1972, death penalties across the country were invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court. But in 1994, the Kansas legislature reinstated the death penalty for crimes committed after July 1st, 1994. So if Dennis did any killing outside of that window, he would benefit by just accepting the charges laid at his feet. And that's exactly what happened. He agreed to provide the court with explicit details on how he selected, stalked, and finally killed each of his victims. Rader's 2-day sentencing hearing started on August 18, 2005. Testimony from law enforcement investigators would describe Rader's documentation of his torture-fueled sex fantasies, and emotional statements were given by victims' family members.
The criminal actions of Dennis Rader caused irreparable damage to the very fabric of my blood family, yet I have never allowed his actions to send me to the dark side.
Nancy Fox is my sister. Nancy's death is like a deep wound that will never, ever heal.
I'd just like for him to suffer for the rest of his life.
I'm Jeffrey Davis, son of Dolores Davis. For the last 5,326 days, I have wondered what it would be like to confront the walking cesspool that took my mother's precious life.
On August 18, 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, a minimum of 175 years without the possibility of parole. Since the sentencing, BTK has made his way into the news cycle more than once. On January 29, 2019, Rader's daughter would write a book about him. Carrie Rawson's book, titled A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Hope, Love, and Overcoming, was a memoir describing her relationship with her father growing up and how she overcame the reality of who he was. Not to be overshadowed, the following month, Dennis would write a letter to the Daily Mail in his first interview since his conviction. He talks about how he's treated like a pet inside the El Dorado Correctional Facility, and he claims that he was possessed by demons named Batter and Factor X when he was committing his crimes. But like the good father he was, he also speaks lovingly of his daughter Carrie following the publishing of her book. Dennis has been in the news as recently as 2023. On July 21st, he compared himself to the Gilgo Beach murderer in a letter to Fox News Digital, calling Rex Heuermann a clone of himself based on the similarities of their cases. On August 23, 2023, Rader was named the prime suspect in 2 unsolved cases. He has been linked to the disappearance of Cynthia Kinney from Oklahoma in 1976, as well as the death of Shauna Beth Garber, whose body was discovered in Missouri in December of 1990. A recent search warrant was even carried out on the lot where Rader's home once stood, and authorities uncovered bondage materials and other items of interest. On September 5th of 2003, police announced that they had yet another possible victim of Dennis Rader. She is apparently identified in one of Rader's color sketches that authorities had had since 2005. The woman who was shown bound and gagged in a barn is believed to have been from southeast Kansas and disappeared in 1991. So as Dennis sits there rotting away in his cell, we're all left to wonder, how many more people did he kill?
Alright, thank you for sticking around until the end. What did you think? Do you think Dennis Rader only killed the 10 people he confessed to? Let me know in the comments. And also let me know in the comments what video you want to see next, what stories you want covered. I'm always checking the comments. A quick thank you to Oompaville for collaborating with me on his channel. As a smaller creator and a longtime fan of his, I couldn't have been more thankful for the opportunity. We cover the darker details of the Cold War. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. The link is in the description. Going forward, I'm going to be tweaking the format of my videos just a little bit so that I can get them out quicker, which means you're going to have to see my ugly mug a little more. Trust me, it makes me just as uncomfortable as it makes you. And finally, I have to give a shout out to my Patreon members who are on screen, who stuck by me as my channel grows. Your support means everything to me. Thank you. Thanks again for watching until the end. I'm really excited to see where this channel is going to go. I guess I'll see you in the next one. Manic, out.